Okay, so today we're diving into something pretty crucial. It's one of those things that maybe doesn't sound super exciting at first, but it really gets to the heart of how Indian democracy works. We're talking about electoral delimitation.
Yeah, delimitation, basically it's about redrawing the boundaries of those electoral constituencies, the areas that elect representatives. And this isn't just some technical bureaucratic exercise. It's really about power, right? It's about whose voices get heard, how political power is distributed, and even, you could say, like, the shape of our political map.
And it's especially relevant now because, we've got this major delimitation exercise coming up in 2026. And there's already a lot of discussion, a lot of debate swirling around it. We're going to try to unpack all of that today, get into the nitty-gritty, using a really interesting analysis from The Hindu as our guide.
It's a dense topic for sure, but I think if we break it down, you'll see why it matters so much, not just for representation, but also for the balance of power between different states and ultimately, the health of our democracy as a whole.
So let's jump right into it, okay? One of the biggest issues that keeps coming up is this difference, right, in population growth rates across India. I mean, we've seen pretty contrasting trends.
Right, absolutely. Some states, like Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, they've seen really substantial population increases.
Yeah, huge growth.
But then you look at, many of the southern states like Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, they've actually been really successful at managing population growth.
Yeah, they've made real progress on that front. So, okay, so we have this kind of demographic divide. What does that mean when we start talking about, like, representation in parliament?
Well, that's where the dilemma kicked in, right? Because if you were to apply like a purely population-based approach to delimitation, to redrawing those electoral boundaries.
Which seems kind of logical, right? More people, more representation.
You'd think so, yeah. But here's the catch. The northern states would naturally end up with way more seats in the Lok Sabha, the lower house of parliament. And the southern states, they'd actually see their number of seats go down. And that raises a huge question. Should states that have, actively worked to control their population, states that have, frankly, made a lot of progress in terms of socioeconomic development, should they be penalized politically for that?
It does seem a bit unfair, like you're doing all the right things, making progress, but then you end up with less of a voice on the national stage. And this is something that the Hindu really emphasized, this whole idea that it could actually discourage states from pursuing population control measures in the future.
It's a real concern. Why would states prioritize that if it means losing political clout? And for our listeners out there, think about the message it sends. States invest in education, healthcare, all these things that contribute to, a better quality of life. And potentially they get punished for it by having their voice diminished in parliament.
Yeah, it's like you're disincentivizing a good behavior almost.
Right, exactly. It just doesn't seem right.
So, okay, so we've got this potential problem brewing with the Lok Sabha, right, the lower house of parliament. But what about the Rajya Sabha, the upper house? How does that play into all of this?
Ah, the Rajya Sabha. Now that's where things get interesting. You see, the Rajya Sabha, as I'm sure many of you know, it's designed to be our Council of States. It's meant to give each state a voice, regardless of its population size.
Right, it's like a counterbalance to the Lok Sabha, which is, based on population.
Precisely. So when you have this potential imbalance brewing in the Lok Sabha, people start looking at the Rajya Sabha and thinking, okay, maybe this is where we could adjust things. Maybe this is how we can ensure that all states still have a meaningful say in national decisions.
So one of the ideas that's been floating around, and the Hindu mentions this as well, is this idea of redistributing the Rajya Sabha seats, right? Making it a bit more balanced across the five main geographic zones: north, central, east, west, and south.
Yeah, that's one proposal that's been gaining some traction. The idea is that if the Lok Sabha becomes, more skewed towards population size, then maybe we need to strengthen the Rajya Sabha to compensate, to make sure that federal equilibrium isn't totally thrown off.
It makes sense in theory, right? But I guess the question is, would it actually work in practice? I mean, would simply changing the number of seats be enough to guarantee that all states have an equal voice?
That's a valid point, and it's something that the Hindu article digs into as well. They point out that a lot hinges on these things called zonal councils.
Oh, right. Yeah, the zona councils. Remind me what those are again?
So these councils were actually created to promote cooperation between states within those different zones, north, south, and so on. The idea was to have a platform where states could come together, discuss common issues, try to work things out collaboratively.
Right. I remember now. It was supposed to be this kind of like a mechanism for strengthening federalism, right? For making sure that states actually work together.
Exactly. But the problem is, a lot of these councils have become pretty inactive. They're not really functioning as intended.
So I guess what the Hindu is saying is that If we're serious about redistributing Rajya Sabha seats to make it more fair, to give all states a voice, we also need to revitalize these zonal councils, right? Make them actually work.
Exactly. It's not just about the numbers. It's about making sure the mechanisms are in place for effective cooperation and representation. So, bolstering these councils, maybe even linking them more formally to the Rajya Sabha, that could be a really significant step.
Okay, so we've talked about the Lok Sabha, the Rajya Sabha, these zonal councils. It's clear that this delimitation thing, it's not just about like drawing lines on a map, right? It's about power dynamics. It's about, the whole structure of our federal system.
Yeah, exactly. It touches on some really fundamental questions about how our democracy functions, about equity, about fairness.
And it's not just theoretical either, right? I mean, we've seen some real-world examples of how this can play out, how delimitation can have a real impact on the ground.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just look at what happened in Jammu and Kashmir in 2022, or in Assam just last year in 2023.
Right. Those are some really important case studies. Let's unpack those a bit, shall we? Let's start with Jammu and Kashmir. What were some of the key takeaways from that delimitation exercise?
Well, I think what was really concerning in the Jammu and Kashmir case was, first of all, the way they added new seats. I mean, they added 6 new seats to the Jammu region, but only 1 to the Kashmir Valley. So right away, you have this kind of imbalance, right?
Yeah, it doesn't seem very proportional.
Right. And then when you look closer, when you look at the way they actually redrew the boundaries, well, things get even more questionable. They started blurring administrative boundaries, merging areas that were geographically distinct, historically separate, like they merged Pooch and Redrawing with Anantnag, which, geographically doesn't really make sense.
Yeah, it raises questions about what the logic was there.
Exactly. And it gets even more complicated when you factor in the communal dimension, which, unfortunately, is impossible to ignore in this case.
Right. The Hindu analysis pointed out that all 6 of those new constituencies in Jammu, they all ended up with Hindu majorities. And there were cases where they seemed to like redraw the boundaries in a way that actually changed the demographic makeup of existing constituencies.
Yeah, and not in a way that benefited Muslim majority areas, let's put it that way.
Right, right. It really does look like they were trying to, engineer the demographics to create a certain electoral outcome.
Yeah, that's the worry, isn't it? That the delimitation process is being used to manipulate the political landscape to favor one community over another. And unfortunately, we see similar concerns in Assam, although the methods were a bit different there.
Yeah, let's talk about Assam. So what happened there?
Well, in Assam, they took a different approach. They decided to merge entire districts, which, as you can imagine, led to pretty significant shifts on the electoral map.
Yeah, merging districts, that's a pretty big deal.
Right. And the result was that 10 constituencies that had Muslim majorities, they were just gone, eliminated.
Wow, 10 constituencies, that's a lot.
Yeah, it's a huge shift. And at the same time, you saw an increase in the number of seats in areas with Hindu and tribal majorities. And again, there were instances where they created constituencies with drastically different population sizes, which suggests that, population wasn't the only thing they were considering.
Right. It seems like there were other factors at play, and those factors, well, they're not exactly spelled out, are they?
No, they're not. But it's hard not to see a pattern here. And the pattern seems to be that delimitation is becoming increasingly vulnerable to political manipulation, and in some cases even community considerations, which is a really dangerous trend.
It's a huge threat to the integrity of our elections, right? I mean, if voters feel like the system is rigged, like their vote doesn't really count because the boundaries are being drawn to favor one group or another, well, that's a recipe for disaster.
Absolutely. It erodes trust in democracy, it breeds cynicism, and it can lead to even greater polarization. And that brings us to, a really sensitive but crucial issue, this whole risk of communal polarization, communities becoming more divided along religious lines.
And it seems like the way these constituencies are being drawn, it could actually exacerbate that problem, right?
Yeah, that's the concern. The Hindu article makes a really interesting point about this. They say that if you keep drawing boundaries in a way that reinforces communal identities, well, it's going to have an impact on voting behavior. People are more likely to vote along communal lines. And that can lead to more division, more tension. And we're already seeing some signs of that, unfortunately, in places like Jammu and Kashmir and Assam.
It's almost like you're creating self-fulfilling prophecies, right? You're drawing these boundaries based on, religious demographics, and then people start voting based on those same divisions, and it just reinforces itself.
Exactly. It's a vicious cycle. And while some states, like West Bengal or Tamil Nadu, they've historically had, more secular voting patterns, you can't assume that's going to last forever. If the delimitation process keeps pushing people into these communal boxes, well, It could change the whole dynamic.
And there's another worrying point that the Hindu brings up, and it has to do with the central government's policies in border states. The concern is that, if this redrawing of constituencies along communal lines becomes normalized in these sensitive areas, well, it could spread, right?
Yeah, it could become the norm across the country. And that's a very scary thought because it would mean that we're essentially institutionalizing communal divisions, baking them into our electoral system.
Okay, so we've talked about the problems, we've looked at some concerning examples, but what about solutions? I mean, where do we go from here? How do we fix this?
Well, it's a tough question, right? Because on the one hand, you want to make sure that representation is fair, that it's based on population, that everyone has an equal voice. But on the other hand, you have to protect the principles of federalism. You have to make sure that all states, regardless of their size or their growth rate, have a seat at the table.
It's like we're trying to balance two competing priorities.
Exactly. And it's a delicate balancing act. But the Hindu does offer a few ideas, a few potential paths forward.
Okay, like what are some of the things they suggest?
Well, one idea is to freeze the number of parliamentary seats, keep it at the current level. But at the same time, you increase representation at the state assembly level.
So basically you shift the focus to state-level politics.
In a way, yeah. And another idea, as we discussed earlier, is to redistribute the Rajya Sabha seats, try to make it more balanced across those different zones. But as the Hindu rightly points out, none of these solutions are magic bullets.
Right, they're not going to automatically fix everything.
No, it all comes down to implementation, to political will. You can have the best ideas in the world, but if they're not implemented fairly, if there's political interference, if there's bias, then it's not going to work.
So ultimately, what's the biggest takeaway here?
I think the biggest takeaway is that this 2026 delimitation, it's a huge test for Indian democracy. It's an opportunity to either strengthen our democratic and federal structures or to weaken them.
It's a crossroads, really.
Yeah, exactly. And it's up to our policymakers to make the right choices, to prioritize fairness, transparency, and a genuine commitment to representing all Indians, regardless of where they live or what their background is.
So to sum up, what we've learned from this deep dive into the Hindus' analysis is that there are two big threats we need to be aware of. First, this potential imbalance of power between northern and southern states. And second, this risk of, communalizing our electoral constituencies, of drawing boundaries in a way that reinforces religious divisions.
And if we don't address these issues and we don't address them carefully, the consequences could be really serious. We could see our democracy become less pluralistic, less representative, and our federal system could become more fragile, more prone to conflict.
So I guess the big question for our listeners is, what role do we play in all of this? As citizens, as informed participants in this democracy, what can we do to ensure that this delimitation process is fair and equitable? How can we make our voices heard?
It's a question worth pondering. And for our listeners who are preparing for the UPSC exams, this deep dive into delimitation is really relevant, especially for understanding Indian policy and federalism. Make sure you understand these issues, the challenges, the proposed solutions. It could very well come up in your mains or even your prelims.
Absolutely. Okay, so if you found this discussion helpful, if you learned something new, please do like and subscribe to the deep dive for more deep dives into important issues. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so leave a comment below. And just to remind everyone, this whole discussion was based on the analysis from The Hindu. So go check out their article if you want to learn more. Thanks for listening.